Russia is bleeding in the Donbas, not metaphorically, literally. Along a corridor that runs from the southern outskirts of Kostiantynivka through the smoldering belt around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, down into the fields north of Novopavlivka and the Oleksandrivka axis, Russian assault detachments are walking into a kill geometry they no longer understand and cannot escape from. The Ukrainian General Staff is logging Russian losses in the range of 900 to 1,200 soldiers killed and wounded every 24 hours. The Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces commander, Major Robert Magyar Brovdy, has confirmed that Ukrainian drones alone struck over 19,000 Russian personnel in just the first 19 days of May, on pace for more than 34,000 drone-inflicted casualties by month's end. And that figure does not include artillery, mid-range strikes, frontline battle losses, or unconfirmed kills. The fighting around the Donbas right now is not heavy in the journalistic sense. It is industrial. It is systemic, and it is the moment a long-standing Russian assumption has finally collapsed in public. This is not a story about a bad week for the Russian army. This is a case study in what happens when a force built on the doctrine of mass attrition meets a defender that has fully industrialized the kill chain. What you are about to hear is not a battlefield report. It is the autopsy of an offensive that the Kremlin still pretends is succeeding. And by the end of this analysis, you will understand not only why Russian forces are taking these losses in the Donbas right now, but why those losses were always going to happen, and why the next 90 days will look worse for Moscow than the last 90, not better. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Rewind 3 months and place yourself inside the assumption that drove Moscow's spring-summer 2026 offensive. The Kremlin's planners believed 3 things, and all 3 of them were wrong. They believed Ukrainian manpower had reached its breaking point. They believed Russian recruitment, even at degraded rates, would always exceed Russian battlefield wastage. And they believed that the Donbas axis, specifically the fortress belt running through Kostiantynivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk, would crack under sustained pressure from the Pokrovsk pivot, because cracking fortified belts is what Russian doctrine claims it knows how to do. Every one of those assumptions has been falsified in the open, on the map, in the casualty ledgers, and in the Russian Ministry of Defense's own quiet redeployments. And this matters enormously because the entire theory of victory the Kremlin sold to itself for 2026 rested on those 3 pillars. Start with manpower. The Russian Ministry of Defense concluded only 70,500 new military service contracts in the first quarter of 2026. The monthly quota Moscow set for itself was somewhere between 33,500 and 34,500 contracts per month. Russia missed it, not by a little, by the margin of an entire month's worth of recruitment. The Ukrainian Defense Minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, confirmed at the beginning of May that Ukrainian forces had crossed the line that strategists had been hunting for 2 years, inflicting more Russian casualties than the Russian state could recruit to replace them. And he did not stop there. He set a new operational target, 50,000 Russian casualties per month. Let that sink in for a moment. The Ukrainian command is no longer trying to stabilize the front. It is trying to break the Russian replacement curve. And on current trajectory, it is succeeding. This is the hidden military variable that mainstream coverage almost always misses. Casualties are not just a humanitarian metric. They are a strategic one. Once your battlefield wastage rate exceeds your generation rate, you do not slow down, you decompose. You start cannibalizing rear units to feed forward assault formations. You strip armor from one axis to plug infantry gaps on another. You ship in motorized rifle regiments to fill tank regiments because there is no one left to crew the tanks. That is exactly what is happening in the Donbas right now, and it is not an opinion. It is documented in Russian military telegram channels themselves. Pull the lens back because here is where the picture sharpens. On May 20th, a source covering the Russian Western grouping of forces openly acknowledged that elements of the Russian 272nd Motorized Rifle Regiment, the 26th Tank Regiment, and the 153rd Tank Regiment, all subordinate to the 47th Tank Division of the 1st Guards Tank Army out of the Moscow Military District, are being redeployed from the Kupiansk direction to the Lyman direction to compensate for heavy losses. Read that sentence twice. Russia is moving elements of its premier tank army not to exploit success, but to patch hemorrhages. And the source explicitly used the phrase heavy losses. That is not Ukrainian propaganda. That is the Russian mill blogger ecosystem describing its own bleed out. It gets even more serious from here. The same redeployment pattern, taken together with the Russian command's apparent abandonment of the Kupiansk effort, tells you exactly what doctrinal failure looks like at the operational level. The Russian chief of the General Staff, Army General Valery Gerasimov, falsely claimed on May 16th that Russian forces had seized the town of Borova. Russian forces have not seized Borova. The Ukrainian flag still flies in Novoplatonivka, in the fields east of it in Shikivka, and in the fields north of Shikivka. A Russian mill blogger himself posted a map acknowledging that, directly contradicting his own general staff. When the highest-serving Russian general is publicly lying about the front line and Russian war correspondents on his own side are correcting him with maps, you are not looking at an army that is winning. You are looking at an army whose information system has decoupled from the terrain. This is the moment a serious analyst stops listening to claims and starts watching geometry. Now move to the Donbas itself, because this is where the fighting is heaviest right now. The Russian offensive design for May was supposed to look like this. Continue the slow, grinding pressure north and northwest of Pokrovsk, push along the Hrishinka River channel toward Mern, Huliv, Shilivka, Yurivka, and eventually Krutoyarivka, hold the southern flank pressure into the Novopavlivka and Oleksandrivka axes, and use the Kostyantinivka direction to keep the fortress belt under threat from the south. The intention was straightforward: collapse the Donetsk Oblast pocket by summer. That is not what is happening. What is happening is the opposite. Ukrainian forces have recently advanced south of Kostyantinivka, not the other way around. Geolocated footage from mid-May shows Ukrainian troops in central Ilinivka, south of Kostyantinivka. ISW has observed a sustained Ukrainian presence in Ilinivka and the southwestern outskirts of Kostyantinivka since the last day of April. Ukrainian forces are holding positions in western Kostyantinivka itself, directly contradicting Russian claims. And footage from May 19th shows Ukrainian troops striking a Russian service member in the southwestern outskirts after a Russian infiltration mission failed. Infiltration is not assault. Infiltration is what an army does when it can no longer mass for attack. And that distinction is everything. This is the doctrinal core of what you are watching. The Russian army has shifted, almost without admitting it to itself, from offensive operations to infiltration warfare. Small groups of 1, 2, or 3 Russian soldiers, often moving through underground gas pipelines around Kupiansk, often dressed in civilian clothes, often armed only with a flag, try to slip into Ukrainian-held terrain, plant a Russian flag for a photograph, and then either die or be captured. A Ukrainian company commander operating in the Kupiansk direction confirmed on May 19th that Ukrainian forces had killed or captured the remaining Russian sabotage and reconnaissance elements operating in the town. That is what victory in Kupiansk looks like in May 2026. Not a counteroffensive in the dramatic sense. A clearing operation. Methodical, lethal, final. And here is the part the mainstream framing does not capture. The flag-raising operations are not military activity in any meaningful sense. They are cognitive warfare. They exist to generate footage that the Kremlin can show on Russian television and that Russian mill bloggers can amplify, to manufacture the false impression that the Ukrainian front line is collapsing. The Ukrainian brigade spokesperson in the Kupiansk direction confirmed this on May 20th. Russian forces are deliberately attempting to infiltrate toward Kupiansk-Vuzlovyi, or the western bank of the Oskol River, specifically to raise Russian flags, photograph them, and run the imagery through Russian information channels. That is not an army conducting a campaign. That is a propaganda apparatus using human beings as disposable camera operators. The question was whether Ukraine could keep up the pressure required to make this trade fatal for Russia. The answer in May 2026 is yes, and the math is no longer subtle. Let me give you the strategic numbers in one stack, because they will tell you more in 30 seconds than any frontline montage. Total Russian military casualties since February 2022 now stand at approximately 1,200,000 killed, wounded, and missing, with as many as 325,000 killed between the start of the war and December 2025. The Institute for the Study of War assessed that Russian forces suffered a net loss of 116 square kilometers of occupied Ukrainian territory in April 2026. That is the first monthly territorial decline for Russia in the Ukrainian theater since August 2024, when the Ukrainian Kursk incursion temporarily inverted the map. The average daily Russian territorial gain in the first third of 2026 collapsed to 2.9 square kilometers per day, down from 9.76 square kilometers per day during the equivalent stretch of 2025. That is more than a 60% drop in offensive momentum across a single year, and it happened while Russian casualty rates climbed, not while they fell. This matters enormously because it falsifies the dominant Western media narrative that Russia is slowly but steadily grinding through the Donbas. Russia is not grinding slowly. Russia is grinding itself. The territorial cost per casualty ratio in 2026 is the worst Moscow has faced in this war. And it is occurring during what was supposed to be the Kremlin's decisive offensive window, the spring-summer push that was supposed to end the Donetsk Oblast campaign before autumn rains and before Western elections reset the political clock. Now expand the lens one more notch, because the industrial dimension is even worse for Russia than the manpower dimension. Ukraine's mid-range and long-range strike campaign against Russian oil refining, oil pumping, and defense industrial infrastructure has accelerated sharply through April and into May. On the night of May 19th to 20th alone, Ukrainian forces struck the AVT-6 primary oil refining unit at the Lukoil Nizhgorodorsk-Intez oil refinery in Kstovo, Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, causing confirmed fires at the facility, confirmed by the governor of Nizhny Novgorod himself, Gleb Nikitin. Ukrainian forces struck the Yaroslavl 3 oil pumping station in Semibratovo on May 19th and damaged 4 tanks with a combined capacity of up to 140,000 cubic meters of petroleum products. Ukrainian forces likely struck the Azot chemical plant in Nevinomysk, Stavropol Krai, and the Moscow oil refinery itself halted petroleum processing after Ukrainian strikes on May 17th. Reuters confirmed it through 2 industry sources. This is not a campaign of harassment. This is the systematic deindustrialization of Russia's wartime energy throughput. Refineries do not restart in days. They restart in weeks. Pumping stations operate at degraded capacity for months. And the cumulative effect on Russian fuel logistics is now feeding directly into Russian frontline performance in the Donbas, because the same trucks that are supposed to push Russian assault detachments toward Myrnorad require diesel that is increasingly difficult to refine and increasingly expensive to move. Pull the lens back further. The Russian state expected a strategic windfall from Vladimir Putin's official visit to the People's Republic of China this week. The headline goal was a signed agreement on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, the centerpiece of Russia's plan to substitute Chinese demand for European demand lost since 2022. Putin failed. Xi Jinping declined to sign. The 2 leaders issued joint declarations, signed roughly 40 intergovernmental documents, and praised their friendship. But on Power of Siberia 2, the central economic deliverable, there was no agreement. The Kremlin's most important geoeconomic bet of 2026 just stalled on stage in Beijing in front of the world. This is what strategic isolation looks like when it is not advertised. Russia cannot replace lost European energy revenue at the price it needs. Russia cannot replace lost battlefield manpower at the rate it needs. Russia cannot replace lost armor at the depth it needs. And Russia cannot replace lost territorial momentum at the speed it needs. Every one of those failures is now compounding the others, and the compounding is showing up in the Donbas as heavy fighting that no longer produces heavy gains. Now let me walk you through the climactic operation, the single moment in the last 72 hours that crystallizes everything we have been discussing. Look at the geometry around Pokrovsk and the corridor leading toward Myrnorad. Russian forces have, according to the Ukrainian 7th Rapid Reaction Corps spokesperson, likely consolidated positions inside Pokrovsk and are now attempting to advance northwest along the Hryshinka River channel toward Myrn, Huliv, Shailivka, Yurivka, and eventually Krutoya Rivka. On paper, this looks like a Russian success. Pokrovsk, the city that defined the entire 2024 to 2025 Donbas campaign, is largely under Russian control. But here's the doctrinal twist that changes the meaning of that fact. The Ukrainian 7th Air Assault Corps has explicitly stated that its objective is to expand the kill zone around Pokrovsk rather than to retake the city in a frontal counterattack. That phrase, expand the kill zone, is the most important phrase in the Donbas right now. It tells you that Ukrainian command has redefined the operational problem. Pokrovsk is no longer terrain to be liberated. It is bait. It is a fixed point. It is the lure that draws Russian assault detachments forward into a layered drone, artillery, and short-range strike envelope that is now killing them at rates no Russian replacement system can match. This is the lesson the casual news consumer misses entirely. In modern drone-saturated warfare, holding a city is not the same as winning around it. The Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces, alongside the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps and adjacent brigades, have built a layered surveillance and strike network across the Pokrovsk-Myrnorad shoulder that turns every Russian advance from Hryshine, every consolidation attempt around Mirn, and every push toward the elevations above the corridor into a documented target. The drone operators use the elevations to provide overhead cover and to suppress Russian counter-drone teams. The Russian solution, and masses of low-cost infantry probing forward, is precisely the wrong solution to that geometry, because the more men Russia pushes through the corridor, the more bodies feed the kill zone. This is why the headline number from Major Brovdy matters so much. 19,203 Russian personnel struck by Ukrainian drones in the first 19 days of May. And that is just the Ukrainian Delta Systems documented count just from drones. When you overlay the artillery losses, the mid-range strikes on Russian command posts in Soledar, the strikes on command and observation posts near Ivanivske, the strikes on Russian drone control points near Perebudova and Podubna, and the deep strikes on logistics rear nodes, you arrive at the casualty curve that explains exactly why the Russian command is now stripping the 1st Guards Tank Army to plug infantry holes on the Lyman axis. The Russian theory of the case in Donbas was, outmass the Ukrainians until they collapse. The Ukrainian theory of the case is, out-engineer the kill chain until Russia cannot afford to keep showing up. And in May 2026, the Ukrainian theory of the case is winning. The broader lesson here is one the Russian military leadership has refused to learn for more than 2 years. Modern combined arms warfare is no longer defined by the side with the largest manpower pool. It is defined by the side with the most lethal sensor-to-shooter loop, the deepest precision strike inventory, and the highest tempo of doctrinal adaptation. Ukraine has built that loop. Russia has not, and every assault wave that crashes against the Pokrovsk corridor or breaks itself against the southern outskirts of Kostiantynivka is, at its core, a Russian institutional failure. Not a tactical mishap, not a bad week of weather, not a junior commander's mistake. An institutional failure, generated at the doctrine level, reproduced down the chain of command, paid for in soldiers' lives. And here is where the historical judgment becomes inescapable. Armies that cannot revise their assumptions die from their assumptions. The German Wehrmacht in the winter of 1942 understood this too late. The French High Command in 1940 understood this too late. The Soviet command in Afghanistan in 1986 understood this too late. The pattern is consistent across a century of military history, a force that wins early through assumed superiority and then refuses to update its operational concept against a faster adapting enemy ends in a casualty curve it cannot reverse. That is the curve Russia is on right now in the Donbas. And the Russian General Staff appears to be the last institution in Moscow that has not noticed. So when you see the headlines about heavy fighting in Donbas, when you see Russian forces taking heavy losses, when you see the casualty figures climbing, understand what you are looking at. You are not looking at a bad month. You are looking at the visible surface of a structural collapse in Russian offensive capacity. The Donbas is not where Russia is winning slowly. The Donbas is where Russia's theory of victory is failing publicly, in real time, on a corridor of roughly 50 kilometers in front of every analyst with a satellite feed and a map. The real question is no longer whether Russia can take Kostiantynivka or hold what remains of Pokrovsk or push to the administrative border of Donetsk Oblast before the autumn. The real question is whether the Russian state can sustain another 6 months of casualties at this rate without a political shock at home, without a recruitment crisis it cannot conceal, and without a fracture inside the senior officer corps that begins asking, in private and then in public, why Gerasimov's claims do not match Gerasimov's maps. History will record that the spring and early summer of 2026 was the moment the Donbas offensive stopped being a Russian campaign and became a Russian liability. And the question that lingers, the one no one in Moscow wants to answer out loud, is the question every great army eventually has to face. What do you do when the doctrine you built your entire war around no longer survives contact with the enemy you assumed could not adapt? That question does not have a simple answer, and the next phase of this war is going to be defined by how Russia tries and fails to answer it. I will keep tracking the Donbas axis closely in the coming days, the redeployments of the 47th Tank Division, the trajectory around Kostiantynivka and Ilinivka, the kill zone expansion north of Pokrovsk, the casualty curve against the Russian recruitment curve, and whether the Kremlin attempts a political reset to cover what it cannot fix militarily. If you want to stay ahead of the casual news coverage and understand the structural logic of what is actually unfolding on this front, subscribe to the channel. We are pushing toward the next subscriber milestone, and every subscriber genuinely helps these analyses reach more serious viewers who deserve clarity instead of noise. Stay with us, because the next 90 days in the Donbas are going to matter more than the last 90 did, and the patterns we just walked through are about to get sharper, not softer.